Imagine trying to measure the temperature outside, but the only tool you have is a wooden yardstick. You can hold it up to the sun, you can stare at the inches and fractions, but it's, it's fundamentally incapable of measuring heat.
Right, because you're applying a rigid, supposedly objective tool to measure something it was just never designed to comprehend.
Exactly. And if you suddenly start forcing people to wear winter coats in July because your yardstick told you it was freezing, well, you're not practicing science anymore. You're just enforcing compliance disguised as data.
That's a really powerful way to frame it, actually.
Thanks. And that is exactly what happened in the early 20th century, which is where we're taking you today. We are exploring how the American eugenics movement essentially built a wooden yardstick to measure human worth and then used it to weaponize the concept of, quote, feeble-mindedness.
Yeah, and specifically, we are looking at how this pseudoscience was utilized to control women's bodies.
We have a pretty heavy stack of sources for this deep dive. We're pulling from legal documents from the 1927 Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, historical transcripts from the PBS documentary The Eugenics Crusade, and fact sheets from the NIH and the Holocaust Encyclopedia covering the history of scientific racism.
And the contrast we are going to examine today is just striking. We are looking at how the exact same surgical procedure, which is supposedly rooted in objective biology, was applied to two women on completely opposite ends of the American class system.
Right, so we have the state-sponsored sterilization of Carrie Buck, who is a poor foster child in Virginia, and then we have the medically sanctioned sterilization of Ann Cooper Hewitt,
who is a fabulously wealthy heiress in San Francisco.
It's a massive paradox, right? Like, how does a system supposedly designed to protect the human gene pool ensnare both a victim of extreme poverty and a multimillionaire?
Well, to understand how Carrie and Ann were targeted, we first have to understand the mechanism behind the movement itself. Where did this whole obsession with measuring human worth actually begin?
Right, so where do the sources trace it back to?
They trace the origin back to late 19th century England, to a statistician named Francis Galton.
Galton?
Yeah, Galton. He was actually a half-cousin of Charles Darwin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and his personal motto was, literally, whenever you can, count.
Wow, okay. That says a lot.
It does. He looked at Darwin's theory of natural selection and concluded that human civilization was basically interfering with it.
Because we were protecting the weak.
Exactly. So he coined the term eugenics, which means well-born. He proposed that society should actively encourage the quote-unquote best people to breed and prevent the worst from breeding.
So he basically wanted to engineer human beings the way you'd engineer livestock.
That is exactly what he wanted. And this idea, it didn't just stay in England. It was enthusiastically imported to the United States by Charles Davenport.
Who was he?
A Harvard-educated biologist. Davenport set up the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor in New York, and this was backed by funding from some major philanthropists.
Right, big money.
Huge money. Initially, they just studied the inheritance patterns of chickens and sheep. But very quickly, Davenport decided that complex human behaviors, things like criminality, promiscuity, or even just a tendency to wander, were dictated by simple Mendelian genetics.
Just like eye color.
Just like eye color.
But I mean, how do you even begin to prove that? You can't exactly put promiscuity under a microscope.
You can't, so you send out an army of field workers.
Ah, right.
Davenport trained researchers to go out into communities, interview families, and essentially draw up these massive human pedigrees.
So they were just making highly subjective moral judgments about a family's cleanliness or work ethic.
Yes, and then they would code those traits as hereditary biological facts on their charts.
Which brings us to the psychological component. Because if you're trying to build a biological hierarchy, you need a way to, sort the population. That's where Henry Goddard comes in, right?
Yeah, Goddard is really central to this mechanism. He was a psychologist working at a training school in New Jersey.
And what did he do?
Well, at the time, a French psychologist named Alfred Binet had developed an intelligence test. It was just meant to identify school children who needed extra academic help.
Yeah, okay, sounds reasonable.
But Goddard brought that test to America and entirely inverted its purpose. Instead of a tool for educational support, Goddard turned it into a strict diagnostic tool to identify what they called the feeble-minded.
And he didn't just use existing categories either, did he?
No, he actually invented a new one to capture people who were otherwise functioning perfectly well in society.
He coined the term moron.
He did. And this is crucial for understanding everything that follows. According to Goddard, the defining characteristic of a moron wasn't a severe lack of cognitive ability.
What was it?
It was a lack of moral judgment.
Wow. That feels like the ultimate diagnostic junk drawer.
A junk drawer.
Yeah, like if a doctor doesn't know what's wrong with you today, they might just say it's stress. For early 20th century society, feeble-mindedness became that junk drawer.
That's a great analogy.
It was a completely unscientific catch-all label where you could conveniently stuff any behavior that challenged the social order.
Right.
Like, a woman has a child out of wedlock. Throw her in the junk drawer, she's a moron. A poor person can't hold a job during an economic depression. Junk drawer. It was just a mechanism to disguise sheer class prejudice as immutable biology.
And the historical context provided by the Holocaust Encyclopedia supports that completely. Eugenics didn't invent social hierarchies or racism or classism.
It just validated them.
Exactly. It offered those existing prejudices a shiny, modern, scientific validation. I mean, think about the era. Rapid urbanization, massive immigration, growing slums, soaring crime rates.
It was a lot of upheaval.
It was. And the elites looked at these complex, overwhelming social problems and decided the fault wasn't a broken economic system or brutal living conditions.
The fault was just bad genes.
Bad genes.
It completely absolves society of any responsibility. I mean, you don't need to build better schools or pay living wages if the people suffering are just genetically destined to fail anyway.
Exactly. And that logic leads directly to the desire for a permanent solution. Eugenicists wanted to change the law to allow for forced sterilization across the country.
But to do that, they needed a constitutional test case.
Right. They needed a bulletproof example to take all the way to the Supreme Court. Which brings us to 1924 and the state of Virginia.
Let's look at Carrie Buck. Because from the sources, she wasn't just randomly selected. She was essentially hunted to serve as the perfect pawn for the state.
Yeah, the story is incredibly bleak. Carrie was a 17-year-old poor white woman. She was living with a foster family, the Dobbs.
Okay.
In 1924, the Dobbs petitioned to have her committed to the Virginia colony for the epileptic and feeble-minded.
And what was their stated reason?
They claimed that because Carrie had become pregnant out of wedlock, it was proof of her moral degeneracy.
But the sources revealed the actual mechanism behind her pregnancy. She hadn't been morally delinquent. She had been raped by her foster mother's nephew.
That is the tragic reality. Her institutionalization was a deliberate cover-up by her foster family. They just wanted to hide their own shame and protect the nephew.
But for the administrators at the Virginia colony, the truth of her assault was completely irrelevant.
Completely irrelevant. The colony superintendent was a man named Albert Priddy. He had been sterilizing women for years and was actually facing legal threats for assault because of it.
So he needed federal legal cover. He needed a law, and he needed a test case to prove the law was constitutional.
Yes. Virginia had just passed a Sterilization Act, and Priddy handpicked Carrie as the guinea pig. She was perfect for their required narrative of heredity because she checked 3 specific boxes.
What were there?
First, her mother, Emma, was already an inmate at the same facility, categorized as feeble-minded.
Okay.
Second, Carrie was now there. And third, Carrie had just given birth to a daughter, Vivian.
Ah, that gave the state their narrative. 3 generations of genetic defect. Wait, I'm stuck on the legal mechanics of this, though. If this was a trial to prove she was biologically defective, they needed medical evidence. But the expert testimony came from Harry Laughlin, who was a major figure at the Eugenics Record Office in New York.
Right.
How does a court accept a binding medical diagnosis from a guy who never even traveled to Virginia to meet the patient?
Well, the court just accepted a written deposition. Laughlin reviewed some notes provided by the colony's administrators and issued a damning biological verdict completely from afar.
That is wild.
He swore under oath that Carrie belonged to the, quote, shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South.
He said that without even meeting her.
Without meeting her.
Yeah.
He also called her a probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring. He concluded all of this entirely through paperwork.
Did Carrie's defense lawyer not tear that to shreds? I mean, it's hearsay. It's not even medicine.
Well, that's the darkest part. The lawyer representing Carrie, Irving Whitehead, was a former board member of the very colony trying to sterilize her.
So he was on their side?
He was completely sympathetic to the eugenics movement. The transcripts show he called no witnesses to defend Carrie's intelligence. He didn't cross-examine the state's experts on their methods.
Wow.
And he completely ignored the fact that Carrie had been a perfectly normal, average student in school before she was pulled out to work as a domestic servant.
So the whole thing was a sham. It was a friendly suit orchestrated by the institution itself to guarantee they would win and secure their legal precedent.
It was a highly orchestrated legal maneuver, and it worked perfectly. The case, Buck v. Bell, goes to the Supreme Court in 1927.
And they ruled against her.
Yes, the court rules 8-1 in favor of the state. They validate the Virginia statute under the 14th Amendment, stating it does not deny Carey due process.
The justification they used is just chilling. The majority opinion was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. How did he legally justify the state cutting open a woman and severing her fallopian tubes against her will?
Holmes utilized the concept of police power.
Hmm?
He actually compared compulsory sterilization to mandatory vaccination or the military draft.
Like it's a civic duty.
Yes. He essentially argued that if the state can call upon its best citizens to sacrifice their lives in war, it can certainly demand a lesser sacrifice from those who supposedly drag society down.
Unbelievable.
He wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind."
And he concluded with a sentence that still haunts American jurisprudence.
He did. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
A total fabrication, validated by the highest court in the land. And this didn't just ruin Carey's life. It created an absolute legal meat grinder.
The fallout was catastrophic. Buck v. Bell provided a green light for states all across the country, and when the Great Depression hit shortly after, the application of this law expanded dramatically.
Because suddenly eugenics wasn't just a biological philosophy, it was a line-item budget strategy.
Exactly. State governments were broke. The PBS documentary highlights how institutions realized it was far cheaper to just sterilize inmates and discharge them than to pay for their lifelong care.
So this supposed pursuit of genetic purity just morphed into an aggressive cost-saving measure targeting people on public welfare.
Yes. Ultimately, over 60,000 Americans are sterilized, disproportionately affecting poor whites, African Americans, Latinx, Native Americans, and people with disabilities.
Okay, so the established logic of the state is clear. Forced sterilization is a tool to eliminate the genetic burden of the poor and the institutionalized. The justification relies entirely on protecting the great race from hereditary defects.
Right.
But the moment you establish a legal weapon that powerful, it doesn't just stay in state hospitals. Anyone with enough influence can pick it up.
Which brings us to San Francisco, less than a decade later, in August of 1934.
We meet 20-year-old Ann Cooper Hewitt. And she is not a ward of the state. She is the heiress to a massive fortune, roughly equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today.
Right. She goes into a private hospital for an emergency appendectomy.
A routine, life-saving surgery.
But during her recovery, she eventually discovers that the doctors didn't just remove her inflamed appendix.
No.
While she was unconscious on the operating table, they also performed a self-appendectomy. They permanently sterilized her without her consent.
She sues her mother and the surgeons in 1936 for $500,000, and the details of this lawsuit are almost unbelievable.
They really are.
It reads like someone trying to steal an inheritance in a pulp fiction mystery novel, but instead of using poison or forging a will, they used the trendy pseudoscience of eugenics to eliminate the heir.
Yeah, the financial motive was glaringly obvious. Ann's late father, Peter Cooper Hewitt, had drafted a very specific will. It stipulated that Ann would receive the bulk of the estate.
But there was a catch.
A huge catch. If Ann were to die childless, the entire fortune would revert to her mother, Marion.
So Marion realizes that if she can guarantee Anne never has children, she secures the entire fortune for herself.
Yes. But when the lawsuit hits the press, Marion doesn't admit to a financial motive, obviously. She deploys the eugenics playbook.
Of course.
She publicly claims she had her daughter sterilized for, quote, society's sake, because Ann was feeble-minded.
She literally grabs the exact same yardstick used on Carey Buck. But how do you convince a court that a highly educated, wealthy heiress is feeble-minded?
Well, by leading heavily into the moral definition of the word, Marion's evidence wasn't about Ann's intellect. It was about her behavior.
Like what?
She claimed Ann had inappropriate infatuations with chauffeurs, with men in uniform, and allegedly had a romantic interest in a black train porter.
So Anne was just socializing outside of her designated upper-class bubble, and her mother framed that as a biological defect.
Yes.
But surely the doctors required some kind of clinical proof before performing an irreversible surgery. They couldn't just take the mother's word for it.
They required an IQ test.
Yeah.
But we really have to look at how it was administered.
Okay, how?
While Anne was writhing in agonizing abdominal pain, waiting for emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix, a psychologist brought in by her mother stood by her bed and asked her questions.
Like what kind of questions?
Things like, what is the longest river in the U.S.?
While her organ is literally bursting.
Yes. And based on her inability to focus on trivia during a medical emergency, they scored her test, labeled her a moron, and wheeled her into surgery to remove her fallopian tubes.
That is just terrifying.
What makes this case so critical to our understanding of the eugenics movement is the profound hypocrisy it exposes regarding the whole concept of superior germplasm.
Let's define that, because that was the whole foundation of the movement, wasn't it? The idea that elite, wealthy, prominent families were just genetically superior.
Yeah, the movement operated on the belief that social standing was a direct reflection of genetic worth. The Cooper-Hewitts were supposed to be the apex of the evolutionary pyramid, according to eugenic theory. Wealth was proof of fitness.
But Marion Hewitt broke the cardinal rule by turning the weapon inward. She used a system designed to police the poor against her own elite daughter.
Exactly.
And this is where I find the legal logic fascinating, because the defense couldn't possibly argue that Anne was a hereditary threat to the state, right? She was an heiress. The state wasn't paying for her care.
No, not at all. And that is exactly where the goalposts shift. If we put Carrie and Anne side by side, the ideological pivot is just undeniable.
How so?
Well, for Carrie Buck, the Supreme Court justified her sterilization entirely on the grounds of heredity, preventing a genetic burden from being passed down, saving the state money.
Right.
But in Anne Cooper Hewitt's trial, the defense brings in Paul Papineau, who was one of the most prominent eugenicists in California. And Papineau legally pivots.
What's his justification if genetics aren't the problem?
Papineau openly admits that heredity is not the issue in Anne's case. He abandons the genetic argument entirely. Yes. Instead, he tells the court that Anne's supposed moral behavior simply made her an undesirable mother. The legal rationale mutated from, was she spread a genetic defect, to, is she fit to be a parent?
That completely exposes the science as a sham. If you're poor, they sterilize you to save the gene pool. If you're rich, they throw out the genetics argument entirely and say, well, she just wouldn't be a good mom.
Exactly.
It proves the biological argument was just a hollow mask for social control. It was whatever the person holding the knife needed it to be.
It was endlessly elastic. And the outcome of Anne's trial demonstrates just how deeply that control had been embedded into the legal architecture of the country.
What was the outcome?
After a sensational trial, the judge dismissed Anne's case against the surgeons. He didn't even have to definitively prove she was feeble-minded.
He just threw it out.
It dismissed it simply because the procedure of sterilization was perfectly legal in California under the broad umbrella of public health.
Because Carrie Buck's case made it legal. The law intended to crush the vulnerable became a convenient, blunt instrument for anyone with the power to wield it.
And as the Holocaust Encyclopedia emphasizes, this wasn't fringe behavior. These theories of racial hygiene were viewed as cutting-edge public health policy internationally, inspiring similar, far more horrific programs globally.
The architecture of control built in America provided a blueprint.
It really did.
It's a heavy history.
Yeah.
But the reason we're unpacking it is because the core temptation behind it hasn't disappeared. We still love the idea of fixing complex, messy social problems with clean scientific solutions.
Absolutely. And we are entering an era where the technological capability is finally catching up to the ambitions of people like Francis Galton and Charles Davenport.
The NIH fact sheet we reviewed brings this history directly into the modern context, specifically discussing the completion of the Human Genome Project and the rise of polygenic risk scores. For those who might not be familiar with the term, polygenic risk scores basically involve looking at thousands of tiny genetic variations across a person's DNA to calculate their statistical risk for complex traits.
Right. And we can use those scores to estimate the risk of heart disease or diabetes, which is incredible for preventative medicine.
Sure, that's amazing.
But the NIH raises the concern that these same statistical techniques are being applied to complex behavioral and psychosocial traits. We now have the genomic data to attempt to screen for intelligence, or a propensity for addiction, or educational attainment.
We actually have the genetic screening tools now that the early eugenicists only pretended to have with their yardsticks and IQ tests.
Which is exactly why understanding this history is critical. The NIH explicitly questions whether genomic-based screening for behaviors might unknowingly echo the history of eugenics.
By creating new societal pressures to eliminate certain types of individuals before they are even born, just based on statistical probabilities.
Unlikely.
It forces us to ask how we define what makes a human life valuable. If you look back at that diagnostic junk drawer, the definition of unfit was so easily manipulated.
So easily.
It was twisted from a fabricated hereditary defect to punish a victim of assault in Carrie Buck's case to a subjective moral judgment to steal a fortune in Ann Cooper Hewitt's case.
The definition of a defect is rarely objective. It is almost always shaped by the social and economic anxieties of the people drawing the boundaries.
Which leaves us with this final thought for you to ponder. We are moving into an age of advanced genetics and artificial intelligence, when the algorithms deciding our biological baselines and polygenic risks are inevitably built by humans.
Carrying the exact same human biases as the people who built the IQ tests a century ago.
Right. Who gets to define what constitutes a genetic defect tomorrow?